Lately, my work has let me think about designing, working on my reputation, and thinking a little bit about what reviews mean. And I came across a really bad review of my work from about 10 years ago. And I realized that it didn't matter. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about with other artists was whether or not reviews matter. And so my takeaways about reviews are, first of all, they don't matter, and they probably won't hurt your sales. And it doesn't matter what level of artist you're at, but if your work is really good and you've got really good proponents for your work, it doesn't matter what happens in the newspapers and what people say about you. In fact, a bad review might help you, and it especially if it's controversial. So one of the things that made me think about this is what kinds of things do matter. And the things that do matter seem to be features in newspapers can often matter. Testimonials and reviews really matter, especially for artists like myself who sell primarily on the web. And your reputation in social media really matters a lot. So those are all the things that you need to think about and think about what matters. So I want to go a little bit more into detail about what that kind of stuff means and take a little bit of a historical point of view about it. So first of all, we've all gotten bad reviews at some point or another. If you've gotten someone bad mouthing you, or you have gotten a poor grade on a report card, or something along those lines. And we can go all the way back to looking at Martin Luther in the 1500s with the Reformation, that one of the things that happened with him and to him was that he wrote a bad review of the Pope and what the Pope's practices were in terms of selling indulgences. And he took that review and sent it as a letter to the Pope, and he put it on the door of Wittenberg Cathedral, which was more or less a kind of bulletin board of the time. And one of the things that happened was that one of the Pope's people, his sort of public relations person, instead of ignoring it, paid attention to the bad review, and it turned into Martin Luther's theses on what was wrong with the church. And it created a whole movement, mainly because this clergyman named Tetzel was so offended by what Martin Luther King, not Martin Luther King, but what Martin Luther said, that he fought him and they tried to excommunicate him, which created so much scandal that it created Lutheranism and Protestantism, Protestants, that movement, and other movements that came from it that were anti-Catholic. So one of the things that the takeaway from that is, if you get a bad review in a newspaper or you get a bad review online, don't talk about it unless it's about how controversial your work is and how you were censored. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But basically, the only time to pay attention to something negative about you and your reputation is when it's about controversy and will make people feel like they're being rebellious if they pay attention to you and your work. So that ties also in with some other people. Historically, there was a painter named Whistler who had painted some very abstract paintings for the 19th century, for the 1800s. And there was an art critic named Sir John Ruskin who got bent out of shape about it and attacked Whistler. And they ended up going into a court battle for libel. And it turns out that Ruskin lost to Whistler and had to pay a fee, which was 1 farthing or something like that, which is basically he handed him a dollar bill in the court, because it was really about reputation. But what happened with that was it increased Whistler's reputation. Now, Whistler spent a lot of money fighting the court battle, so that's also another lesson, but it also increased his fame, and it increased Ruskin's fame to have this battle in court. And it's one of the things that is sort of important, is that every time there's a controversy or some sort of battle in a public forum, it creates fame for both of the parties. So don't knock getting a bad review. It could be helpful if you can fight it in public and you can make that person look like a jerk, or both sides can argue it and it keep going in courts. Now, the same thing happened with John Singer Sargent, the painter, and a painting he did of so-called Madame X. There was a controversy about whether or not the painting was appropriate, and in some ways it created a clamor for Sargent's work, even though in the art history books you'll see, or people will say, that Sargent was being attacked and it created problems for his career. It probably didn't. It created a lot of fame for him, and it got his name into a lot of people's heads and created him as a household name because of the controversy. The same thing happened in the 1913 Armory Show, and Stieglitz and his art gallery, who was a famous photographer, every time those guys got a bad review and the Armory Show of 1913 got slammed in the newspapers as being too modern and too crazy, it created so much controversy that people went down to go see it. And as a matter of fact, I forgot to put this in my listing, but the same thing also happened with the Impressionists, that the Impressionists who couldn't get into the salon had a salon of refusals, an alternative site, and people went to go see it and to deride it, and because it got a bad review in the paper, and the guy said it's just the first impression of what people are seeing, and that ended up becoming the name of Impressionism, and it also created fame for them. So a bad review is actually a good review. Any press is good press. So I wanted to talk next about the different levels of press and what kinds of things happen in terms of certain kinds of press or certain kinds of things in print. First of all, my first brush with virality, or with something going viral for me, was I did a how-to article. And the how-to article was basically about how to make a painting. And a friend of mine took that article and shared it, and it blew up, and I got thousands of hits on it on my blog. And it led to people getting interested in my work, and it also led to several features in American Artist Magazine and the Artist Magazine, where I wrote articles, and they were how-to articles. And I was able to start increasing my reputation because I wrote articles about how to make art. So that was one of the things that happened for me. As a friend shared something online. He was very popular. He was an animator at PDI, and he ended up helping my reputation and launching my blog. So that was one of the things. The other thing that started happening was I had a show in Sacramento, and the work was too racy for Sacramento, and it was at a teachers association. They had an art gallery, and so I got really pissed off about it, and I ended up sort of writing a sort of short article, and I sent it off to all of the newspapers in the area. And the result was that the Sacramento Bee, the Oakland Tribune, and some other papers picked it up and ended up running it as a feature. And what was so cool was a gallery in Sacramento ended up picking up my work because of the article and started showing my work. And so that led to some measure of success. So that was also something that was very useful for me. Another sort of thing that happened was I had a bad review at one point that I thought about. And I just was so busy with the shows that I was doing that this bad review was so offensive to me that I just didn't have time to respond to it or think about it, and I didn't even promote it or share it with anybody. And as a result, nobody cared and nobody read the review. And now 10 years later, when I was putting together a press packet, I thought, oh, do I need to include that review? And I read it, and it was negative, but it was clear that the author hadn't done the research about my work from beforehand, which was about the controversy and why I was making a show that was not controversial. And so it ended up being uh, uh, a zero-sum game. It just didn't do anything against me or anything for me because I chose to ignore it. And what was so interesting was I got tons of blurbs and pieces in the newspapers from that point forward and online, even announcements and think pieces and people writing up columns about me. But none of those things seemed to really do anything to launch my shows or have an effect on whether or not my work sold. And what's so interesting is even with the show that I got the bad review on, I sold every single one of those paintings over the next 2 or 3 years after the show through my website. So one of the things that I think is most important, especially in this day and age, to think about is your reputation and the testimonials that you have matter more than anything else you could do in terms of getting press and in terms of getting reviews. And what I'm talking about specifically is that on, for instance, websites like Etsy or your own personal website, the testimonials that people give you and the reviews that they give you and the word of mouth that happens on Facebook and Instagram and the sharing that happens matter so much more in terms of whether or not your work will sell than anything that happens in a newspaper or an art magazine. They, frankly, the public will make your career and will sell your work if you have a good reputation and you do a good job getting the work to them on time and you're not a mean or churlish kind of person. And testimonials and product reviews do more for you than any newspaper review would ever do for you. And your behavior on social media would also affect whether or not people are willing to buy from you, and how generous you are really matters the most. So those are the thoughts that I had about whether or not reviews matter and whether or not you should think about worrying about them. Now, I want to end on a last note, which is all of the print reviews and all of the things that I got while I was, sending off emails to newspapers and trying to get all of that press stuff, and the interviews that I've had online and that I've answered have come in handy as something that I downloaded and then laid out as a sort of magazine of all of the reviews that I've ever gotten and all of the features that I've gotten. Not all of them, because it's probably missing about 10 or 15 of them. But what's really cool about this is it goes back about 10, 15 years, and I've reprinted all of these articles. And so whenever somebody buys a painting from me, I send them one of these magazines that I've made using a printer, and they read through it, and it gives my work a sort of authority. And so that is one of the things that you can recycle these old features and old reviews and use them to increase your reputation.